What is up, guys? So I got a request to check out the best Sony smartphones. So let's go ahead and dive into it right now. So your number one, most premium pick is still going to be the Sony Xperia Mark III. This phone is going to be released in the US August 19th, and it's going to be a beast of a phone, guys. So this phone is going to have a premium design, glass back, aluminum frame, IP65 and 68 dust and water resistant. You also have and this is pretty much a highlight with the phone, a 6.5 inch 120 hertz display, and it is a 4K display, 643 for the PPI. Absolutely a monster of a display, one of the best displays currently, or the highest spec displayed that we have right now. So it is going to be extremely sharp, just being able to watch content in 4K and still have the smoothness of 120 hertz. And with that, screen, it is going to cost you a pretty penny. It is a phone that's around the $1,300 mark, actually, so it's a very expensive phone. So it is running a near stock version of Android with Android 11, the Snapdragon 888 and Adreno 660. So it is going to be, of course, a flagship phone, so it's going to be extremely powerful when it comes to gaming and performance in general. You also have micro SD support, 256 gigs of internal storage and 12 gigs of RAM on the base model. Stereo speakers are on board. Headphone jack is on board, which is very rare for a flagship phone as well. You also have NFC, and then you have a fingerprint scanner on the side mounted, which from what I've seen works great. And also Sony has some pretty great cameras from what I've seen. So you have a 12 megapixel standard and a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. You also have a 12 megapixel ultra wide and then a 0.3 depth sensor, and you also have 4K video at 24 frames, and then you have an 8 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p. So the cameras, from what I've seen, it's going to take excellent photos, up there with some of the best. I have seen a couple mixed reviews, but I think once Sony gets the software sort of out, because a lot of those reviews, they come from early units. So I say give it some time for that software updates to come in. So you do have a 4,500 milliamp battery, which seems a little small for the display resolution on this guy, with 30-watt charging, wireless charging, and reverse wireless charging. So this is going to be the best of the best. All right, next is the Sony Xperia Mark II. So basically, this is the predecessor, but it still offers a lot, and basically it's going to be $300 cheaper. So if you do really want, Sony top of the line's flagship phone, you don't want to pay quite that much, this is still a great option. You still have pretty much the same design, aluminum frame on here, your IP rating, but instead this one has the 4K display at 6.5 inches, 643 for the PPI, pretty much the same display, but there's no high refresh rate. So you do have a 4K display, it's just not a high refresh rate, and that display is still OLED, still pretty much the same thing. You also have Android 11 on here, Snapdragon 865 and Adreno 650, still a flagship smartphone, still going to be extremely fast. Also, you have micro SD support, 256 gigs of internal storage and 8 gigs of RAM. You also have the stereo speaker still on here. The headphone jack is still on here. NFC is still on here. Your physical fingerprint scanner on the side is still on here. You still have a quad camera setup, 12 megapixel standard, 12 megapixel telephoto, and then a 12 megapixel ultra wide, 0.3 depth sensor, 4K video, and then an 8 megapixel selfie. So as you can see, essentially the same phone with just a minor spec bump. And you also have a slightly smaller battery on here, a 4,000 milliamp battery, 21 watt charging with 11 watt fast charging as well. So again, this is going to be a great option for someone who doesn't quite want to spend that much money. All right, next is going to be a little bit more budget friendly option, the Sony Xperia 10 Mark III. So this is around $400, so this is definitely not as expensive as those two flagships. And you still have on here a kind of a premium design, glass back, plastic frame on here. You do have an IP rating on here, which is really nice, and you also have a 6-inch OLED display, 1080p, 457 for the PPI. So no, there's no high refresh rate, but also with this phone, you're getting a high quality display with no notch. So that is also something to think about as well. I do love that Sony does not embrace the notch at all with their smartphones. And the same story on here, Android 11, pretty much stock experience with the Snapdragon 690, Adreno 619, pretty much a mid-range chip. It's going to be able to handle, medium, setting gaming and also just navigating the OS pretty smoothly. You also have micro SD support, 128 gigs of internal storage and 6 gigs of RAM. You also have a headphone jack on here with just a single firing speaker, and you do have NFC on board with a physical fingerprint scanner. And then this phone has a triple camera setup, a 12 megapixel standard, 8 megapixel telephoto, and an 8 megapixel ultra wide. It can shoot in 4K with a 8 megapixel selfie that shoots in 1080p. Now this phone also has a 4,500 milliamp battery with 30 watt charging as well, so you should get some pretty good battery life. So I think this is overall a really good option for Sony fans, especially if you want a Sony phone at a cheaper price here. Now next would be the original Sony Xperia One. So this is basically for anybody that wants a 4K phone but you don't want to shell out the $1,000 price point. You can find this for around $584. So if you really want a 4K phone, definitely check this one out. It's got the same, pretty much design. It's aluminum frame on here, glass back, IP68 dust and water resistant. You have the OLED 6.5 inch 4K, no notch, no punch hole display. 643 for the PPI, and it's a really nice display. Like I said, if you want a 4K display, this is definitely something to consider. And remember, these Sony Xperia phones have a 21:9 aspect ratio, so they're very tall phones as well, so take that into consideration. This phone also got the Android 11 update, Snapdragon 855, Adreno 640. You guys know the Snapdragon 855 phones, test them out on the channel all the time. They still work very, very fast, so definitely it's still a fast phone. Micro SD support, 64 gigs of internal storage and 6 gigs of RAM on here. You also have stereo speakers. Unfortunately, this one did not have a headphone jack, so I'm glad they actually brought the headphone jack back on the newer ones. So you do have on here NFC. The fingerprint scanner is still side mounted, works fine. And then you have a triple camera setup, a 12 megapixel standard, a 12 megapixel telephoto, and a 12 megapixel ultra wide, 4K video, and an 8 megapixel selfie that shoots in 1080p as well. So this phone also has a 3,330 milliamp battery, which is a little small, and 18 watt charging. So like I said, this is definitely the phone for anybody that wants that 4K display, but you don't want to pay, almost $1,000 for the phone. All right, so last would be the Sony Xperia 10 Mark II. So this is just slightly cheaper. I think one of the cheapest phones on the list at around $300. So this one has a glass back, plastic frame on here, IP rating on here. You have a 6-inch OLED display, 1080p, 457 for the PPI. This did get the update to Android 11 as well. Snapdragon 665, so it belongs in that mid-range category. So if you can't get the the 3, then you would get this one just to save an extra $100. And performance-wise, this phone is going to be fine. It's a mid-ranger, so don't expect to go too crazy. Micro SD support is on here, 64 gigs of internal storage and 4 gigs of RAM. You also have on here a headphone jack with a single firing loudspeaker. NFC is on board, as well as a fingerprint scanner side mounted. You do have some pretty good cameras on here, a triple camera setup, 12 megapixel standard, 8 megapixel telephoto, and an 8 megapixel ultra wide with 4K video and an 8 megapixel selfie cam as well. This phone does have a pretty decent sized battery at 3,600 milliamps with 18 watt charging as well. And like I said, this is your cheapest option, currently that's actually more relevant. You have cheaper ones, but they're not super relevant. They're not running the latest version of Android, so this would be your best option if you want the cheapest Sony Xperia smartphone. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.